Good afternoon, everyone. I'm thrilled that you could all join us today. I'm Connor Murnane, the Director of Engagement and Mobilization for the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, or FIRE. For those of you who do not know, FIRE is the leading defender of First Amendment rights, both on and off campus. For over 2 decades, we've made a point of defending speech regardless of viewpoint or identity. If expression is protected by the First Amendment, FIRE defends it, period. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special shout out to the Harvard Alumni for Free Speech for co-sponsoring this webinar. HAFFS is a 501c3 nonpartisan organization dedicated to preserving and promoting free expression, academic freedom, and viewpoint diversity throughout the global Harvard-Radcliffe community. You can find them online at their website, harvardalumniforfreespeech.org. So we're here today to talk about Harvard, an institution that long ago achieved legendary status in higher education, not just in the States, but around the world. Unfortunately, in recent years, Harvard has had its fair share of free speech-related issues. In FIRE's most recent college free speech rankings, Harvard found itself dead last. Before we get to the why and how of that last place finish, let me introduce our panelists and offer an apology. The folks about to talk to everyone have some incredible backgrounds, but I had to cut some of it so we could get to the meat of the discussion as soon as possible. After all, you're not here to hear me ramble, you're here for them. So to start us off, Sean Stevens is the Director of Polling and Analytics at FIRE. Sean is a native of New Jersey and obtained his PhD in social psychology from Rutgers University in 2013. He would continue to work at Rutgers University, first as a research director of the Social Perception Lab, and then as a postdoctoral fellow. His postdoctoral work was done in affiliation with the Center for Advanced Studies in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University. In 2016, Sean became Heterodox Academy's first director of research, where he developed the Campus Free Expression Survey. In 2020, Sean joined FIRE as a senior research fellow in polling and analytics, and he continues to work here today, leading FIRE's college free speech ranking project. Professor Mark Ramseyer is the Mitsubishi Professor of Japanese Legal Studies at Harvard Law School. After earning his JD at Harvard, Professor Ramseyer would go on to be a Fulbright Fellow at the University of Tokyo, teach as a member of the faculty of UCLA and the University of Chicago, as well as numerous prestigious universities overseas, publish numerous works, including top-rate law textbooks. And as a result of some of his research into sensitive issues involving Korean and Japanese history, the professors personally encountered challenges to academic freedom and diversity of viewpoint. Gia Lee graduated from Harvard Business School in 2006. Gia received a BA degree in economics from Cornell University and her MBA degree from Harvard Business School. Her career spanned a wide spectrum in finance, including investment banking at Morgan Stanley, private equity investment at One Equity Partners, public equity investment at Trellis Management Company and Aragon Global. And last, but certainly not least, is Omar Wabi. Omar is a senior at Harvard College, concentrating in computer science and economics. He is currently serving as vice president and communications director of the Harvard Salient, a publication whose mission is to revive constructive political conversations and free speech on Harvard's campus. He is also an associate for the Harvard Undergraduate Data Analytics Group and a clarinetist for some of Harvard's best orchestras. So for the rest of this webinar, I'm going to ask a few questions to each of the panelists, and after that, we'll open it up for a Q&A with the audience. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom display. We'll do our best to get as many of your questions as possible, and if not, I'll download a copy so we can reach out to you via email and get any of your questions answered after the fact. So now let's kickstart the conversation with Sean. Sean, you're the Director of Polling and Analytics. Can you give us a brief overview of the College Free Speech Ranking Project and its methodology, and then dive a little deeper into how Harvard earned a score so low we had to generously round up?
Yeah, so FIRE started this 4 years ago. The first round of this was in 2020. We've expanded the number of schools we've surveyed every year. And the scores are based on survey data that we obtain through our large ranking survey, but then also on other kind of campus indicators that we track. So we track campus disinvitation attempts of speakers. We track attempts to sanction scholars. We added a component this year that involves attempts to sanction students and student groups. Schools get bonuses if they defend speech rights. They get penalized if sanctions occur to these various categories of people. And then we also factor in our evaluation of the university's speech policies. From the survey data, we generate a number of different components. We have questions that ask about comfort expressing ideas. We have questions that ask about the acceptability of certain kinds of protest, disruptive conduct. We assess the perception of how much the administration is supportive of free speech. We ask students to identify topics that they have difficulty having an open and honest conversation about. And then we have a few measures of tolerance. And I'll just say there, that's actually the domain I'll highlight and throw Harvard a praise, is they do well on the tolerance components, actually. It's kind of all the other ones that are a little problematic. And so then Harvard specifically, as you know, getting a little bit more into that, is on many of the remaining components. They're middling at best to mediocre to even poor. But the real, I would say the driving force as to why the score was what it was is we documented 7 different sanctions, whether it's of speakers, professors, or students. And so a couple of these were disinvitations. One involved an event being disrupted, had to be postponed, or not postponed, it had to be stopped for 30 minutes, moved to a different location, and then resumed. And another one is a student had their acceptance rescinded due to social media posts they made when they were like 15, 16 years old, that were unearthed after after he was accepted to the school. And then there's also 4 sanctioned scholars, and a number of these include terminations of faculty members. Those things are kind of that record is what drove Harvard down to the bottom of the rankings. Although even a better record there, I mean, their performance still wouldn't be great. Effectively, like they still don't do very well on many of the survey components either. And I think that's like focusing so much on the actual score or where they necessarily fall in the rankings maybe misses the forest for the trees a little bit. In all 4 years we've done this, they've never been very good.
Can you elaborate a little bit on those the sanctions and disinvitations? Mm-hmm. So in the FIRE rankings, we give a speech climate. Harvard, I believe, was the only school to get the abysmal label. How do those one-off instances kind of affect campus on a larger scale?
Okay. And why so if, like I said, if a school university defends a speaker's rights during these controversies, they receive a bonus. They go up in the rankings. When a sanction occurs, the most severe one is firing a tenured professor. Yep. And then after that, it's firing a non-tenured professor, revoking an invitation to a speaker, and if an event was disrupted. So they're scaled. So there's like severity of penalties, and then as you get down to things like this professor was placed under investigation, the penalty is not as severe as being fired, there's still a penalty. We set these to decay over time. So something that occurred in 2021 might still be factored in as a penalty, but it's not as strong as it was in 2021, basically.
Got it. All right. So I'm going to turn over to the professor for a minute now. You've been at Harvard in a faculty capacity for 20 or 30 years, if my math is correct, and that's always a dangerous phrase. So what do you make of Harvard's placement in these rankings, and what do you see changing in the environment for faculty on campus over the years?
It's clearly gotten much worse. I mean, we are in a very bad situation. And Sean talked about sanctions on faculty. Harvard is worse than the number that FIRE comes up with, because you don't have all the sanctions, and there's a reason that you don't have them, which is that Harvard, like other schools, when it disciplines, investigates, and so forth, a professor imposes brutal gag orders. And so telling anybody about what Harvard is doing to you is itself an independent offense that will get you nailed and fired potentially. So Harvard is sanction academics, professors, for publishing articles that come to politically disfavored conclusions, right? I mean, it happens. It is happening, and it's hard to think of anything that is such a clear, in-your-face violation of academic freedom as punishing professors for the conclusions that they reach in their articles. But it's the people who are subject to this can't talk about it, and so unless you have friends, you won't hear about it. Some of us like to gossip. Some of us have our ears to the ground, and so we learn about this stuff. But otherwise, you don't. The one thing that I would say, not in Harvard's favor, but to suggest that it's not as bad relative to the others, is that I think this happens at a lot of other schools too. And I have my ear to the ground at Harvard. I don't have same information from other schools. And so it wouldn't surprise me if much the same thing is happening at other places. I don't hear about it. The one that we've all heard about is Joshua Katz being canned at Princeton and basically fired for criticizing a race-related faculty proposal. The pretext there was a Title IX claim. And when Harvard goes after a professor for reaching the wrong conclusion, sometimes it's a pretextual Title IX claim. Sometimes it's a claim that he or she is taking lots of quotations out of context. There's usually a pretext. You don't get punished saying, we don't like your conclusion. There's a pretext. But the reason that we hear about Joshua Katz is that he was fired. And so he's what we call a last period problem, right? He has no incentive to cooperate. If a professor is just told you're going to go on leave for a year without pay, I'm going to dock your salary 30%, I'm going to drop your endowed chair, the professor is going to try to cooperate. And so he or she will keep this quiet. One thing to add is that what's if anything surprising about Joshua Katz, it's that we hear about it because what I hear from other friends at other schools is that when you have a bad news dean that decides to start firing people for political reasons, the dean will tell the prof, I'm firing you. The prof will say, make my day. I'll meet you in court. I'll write 5 op-eds. And then they negotiate for 5 minutes, 5 days. And the school pays the professor $100,000, $200,000 and gets a non-disparagement agreement.
Can I ask a quick question on this topic? The purpose of the university, right? Pursuing knowledge, finding out the truth, training scholars. What does an environment like that do to a non-tenured younger professor who's not just trying to make a name for themselves, but make a living? Is this kind of environment stunting research, stunting progress? What's that like for someone who hasn't, had as long as you have had to build a body of work that's respected?
Oh, it's got to be a disaster, I would think. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, that's a good enough answer. Sean, we talk gag orders at Fire all the time for any number of issues. Do you just want to talk about how they factor in or not factor into the college free speech rankings?
Yeah, I mean, I think Mark's right that like the universe of sanctions that we have tracked of these actual things, I think it's bigger than what we've been able to track at most of the universities. But we do our best to kind of, and I do think like a school like Harvard probably does get more attention to these things, so it might be easier to track them at a school like Harvard or a school like Columbia or Yale, schools like this, because they're going to get the press attention that maybe a smaller liberal arts school in a small town somewhere is not going to get. But we do our best to track this. We do have we have like if you're placed under investigation, that's a penalty. If you're suspended, that's a penalty. Like there's this whole tier of things. But yes, I would say I would not be surprised to find out that we're undercounting these instances because of the way universities will handle them. I can say, as when I was in graduate school and a postdoc and I taught, I felt things changing as well, like things that I would maybe cover or teach at the beginning of my career there. By the time I was, towards the end of it, I was like, yeah, it's not really, we're not going to go there. It's just someone's going to get annoyed about this, which is not good for, the project of knowledge. And also I've done some research on faculty experiencing like political discrimination in the academy. And so one of these was a more qualitative project. And to Mark's point, and to your question, we have a qualitative, like an interview subject who literally was like, yes, I've been told some of these are great research ideas that you should table and pursue after you get tenure. Because if you do it now, you're not going to get tenure.
Oh, well, wow. So now that we've heard from a former faculty member and a current faculty member, I want to turn to Omar for a few minutes. Omar, you're a senior, just started your 4th year. You've experienced Harvard. What do you make of the rankings, and do they match up with your experience? And one other thing, if you could touch on, if my memory's right, when we spoke previously, you had a ton of praise for some particular departments at Harvard, and I'm all about being fair here. If you want to talk about some of the better experiences as well, please do, because they're models that should be replicated.
Yeah, thank you, Connor. Nice to meet everyone on the call as well. So I think for me, I personally think that the ranking doesn't necessarily reflect Harvard's standing. I think it actually stands, at least from the student's perspective, should be a little bit higher. And my reasoning is this: it's because the vast majority of the student body, at least people I've interacted with throughout the past 3, now going on 4 years, has been pretty centrist, to be all honest. There are some very noisy people on the extremes who like to contribute a lot of the radical discussion that you see on social media, and that'll always be the case. But the vast majority of people, friends, peers, classmates who I've talked to, have been very reasonable. Even if they may be liberal or conservative, they will listen to someone else's perspective. They will hear them out. And I've been in many conversations where I've talked to someone who could disagree with almost everything I say, but they will say at the very end, hey, you know what? Great conversation. I'm glad you didn't, circle back or take your points back. You defended them, and I wanted to hear your argument. And I think that is a sign, at least among students, I feel that, there is hope for restoring that culture of really being able to have open dialogue across all sorts of topics.
I love hearing that, but I do want to push back a little bit. So I'm just sticking with the ranking data here. 70% of students surveyed at Harvard say shouting down a speaker to prevent them from speaking on campus is at least rarely acceptable. So, I love the world you're painting, but that's a large majority saying that shout downs to stop speech is fine. If that big if whatever standard they, think is rarely acceptable is met. Is that, you don't think that's a problem, or a sign of some deeper liberal culture?
Well, I would say that it's definitely a problem if a lot of people think that shutting down speech is a good thing or an acceptable thing, right? I'm just saying that in my experience, it's not necessarily been a too big of an issue. I have encountered personally people who have alienated me or ostracized me because of my beliefs. For example, as vice president of the Salient, I do get a lot of questions from people sometimes. Like, I remember one person actually last semester asked me, do you even believe what you actually write? And that was something that I took a minute to digest, because, I could not imagine, doing anything else. But I think that while, yes, you look at the statistics and the polls, right? Most students here are liberal, or at least they identify to be liberal, right? And that's been corroborated by the Harvard Crimson Survey and Also, there's a new survey that came out from the Network of Enlightened Women and the Leadership Institute at Harvard that just actually came out recently about the polls of political identification. And I actually have it over here opened up. Basically, it looks like the initial statistics of the Crimson were kind of skewed toward the liberal side, actually. According to this survey, about 22% of the student body identify as either conservative or libertarian. And then the rest, about 57% liberal, and then the remaining 21% roughly socialist. So, you know, I think that a lot of times when it comes to these kinds of surveys, you know, there can be a little bit of inaccuracy depending on who reports, who actually submits answers, and the kinds of people they're going out to. Not to say those are not legitimate surveys, but, you know, I think it's a lot of Harvard students might honestly just opt not to respond to those based on how things are.
Thank you. Gia, I promise I'm going to get to you, but Sean looked like he was chomping at the bit to get something out.
I was going to say, so our data actually shows very similar percentages of Harvard students identifying as conservative. I think we get it around 18%, and I think there's another 1 or 2% that say libertarian as well. So that's similar to this other survey that Omar is mentioning. And, you know, I'd also say, on this point, that actually Harvard's that's a decent amount of conservatives compared to most of the other Ivy League schools. When I've looked at it, and also the way the students, the way Harvard performs on our tolerance components, I think also in some ways backs up some of what Omar is saying as well. Like, they, compared to other schools, they are more tolerant of conservative speech in a lot of ways. And I think on the shout down question, I would say it's important to keep in mind that the way that someone's answering that question is they're probably thinking of like the worst kind of speaker possible that would be on campus, versus the other tolerance questions. It's like, it's specific speakers. It's like, they said this, are you okay with this person coming on campus? Versus on the acceptability question, it's like kind of left up to the person answering it. And I would imagine they're thinking about someone pretty beyond the pale.
Naturally.
Answer that way. Yeah.
Gotcha. Well, thank you. All right, Gia, you attended Harvard for graduate school, an MBA to be exact. You know, I know nothing about MBA programs, so I was doing a little digging into the Harvard Business School, and they rightfully brag about a pretty awesome percentage here. They say, quote, over 50% of our graduates who create over 50% of our graduates create at least one new venture. My apologies. So when I see that, that's great. You know, you're producing innovative thinkers who are going out there and making something. Are you concerned about this potential innovation being stunted due to rampant issues of self-censorship, or, you know, the fact that our rankings show that 58% of students report that they are worried about damaging their reputation because someone misunderstands something they've said or done? When I see something like that, you know, if this is how students feel in the comfort of a classroom, what happens when they're thrust into a boardroom or a debate on how to run a business? Do you have any thoughts on that, or what may be happening to the graduate program since you've left?
Yes, I do think that there is a continuing trend that graduate students or alumni are more and more concerned about how they voice certain dissenting views. It's very interesting that we had this discussion among a alumni group just a few months ago. So we had a discussion on whether or not we should allow certain controversial speakers to be on campus. And it's very interesting that, you know, many feel that for a prestigious platform like Harvard, like any other Ivy League, if we allow controversial speakers on campus, implicitly we're giving them a forum to expound their views. And as a result, that should not be considered advisable. Now, my view is that whether or not you agree with the speakers, we should allow any kind of discussion. The better way to do it is to allow the debate. If you wanted to expose whatever fallacy that you want to, you know, you think the speaker is, you know, talking about, And that doesn't seem to be, or at least when during our discussion among the alumni group, that doesn't sound like to be the prevalent view. And I am concerned that in corporate governance, in the boardroom, there's going to be this more and more likely a trend to jump on the bandwagon of what the prevalent political wind is like. And so I'm not sure that's certainly not the right thing to do in my mind, because it's going to hurt our innovation, it's going to hurt our productivity, it's going to hurt our prosperity. And some of you may know that I came from the culture is not the right word, sorry. The regime, I grew up in China, that free speech was not, allowed. And I am just concerned that I'm seeing certain trends that's going on in my new homeland that's not kind of productive if we go down the route that there's only one right way, there's only one noble way of doing things, whereas everything else is not right and should not be talked about. And some alumni are just not comfortable voicing their, dissenting opinions, and it's very sad. So, I'm glad to hear that maybe among the students, it's, possibly not yet the trend, or maybe the students who are self-censoring, they're not exactly saying that though to their friends. I don't know. So at least that's something that I feel that's been changing in the last, 20 some odd years that I've been here.
Gotcha. Well, thank you. And you kind of gave me a nice in, because I haven't figured out a way to jam this question in, but here we go. So in some of our talks, Professor, in preparation for this webinar, you brought up holistic admissions as a potential cause for speech issues on, we're seeing on campuses. Would you mind elaborating on that? I just found your point somewhat interesting, and I think they may add something to the conversation.
Yeah. So I think part of what a big part perhaps of what the data that Sean presented was that students are scared. Undergraduate students are scared to speak up, and I have a sense that this is partly a result of our admissions policy at Harvard, for the Harvard College, which is that if you think about what it is, Harvard College has a fairly high minimum of academic ability and willingness to work hard, but it sets this minimum and then it chooses students, and you look at it from the outside and it sort of seems like they're choosing them randomly. Of course, the admissions office doesn't think it's choosing them randomly. It thinks it's looking for certain types of students. But I think what this does, and this is only a tendency, this is not, I'm not saying all students are like this or even most students are like this, but I think as a tendency, it disproportionately causes Harvard to choose students who don't have a sense of self, who don't have a self-confidence in their own abilities, and who have gone through life trying to figure out what the right answer is, rather than to say what they think, which is, let me explain. Holistic admissions, once you're above the cut, is about trying to figure out what the admissions office wants, what kind of person they want. And then you try to create a persona of yourself that's what the admissions office wants. And so of course it's fake, it's fraud, right? I mean, that's not who you are. But holistic admissions, you've heard that the admissions office is looking for this and this and that, and 6 extracurriculars and 2 presidents and so forth. And so you try to create a picture of yourself that's what the admissions office wants. And I think disproportionately, the students who are best at this are the ones who don't particularly have a sense of self. They don't think of themselves as like this or not. And so they try to do whatever the admissions office wants. Students who have self-confidence, and who know what they think and know who they are and are proud of it, will have a harder time doing this. Some of them will be successful, obviously, but in general, they will find it harder to fake it just because they know who they are. And those students will end up at the next tier down, which are the very good public schools. They'll be at the top of their class because they're smart and they work hard. They have self-confidence, and they will set the tone of these schools. And these schools, by Sean's data, don't have as high a fraction of students who are scared of speaking out and so forth. But disproportionately at Harvard, I think holistic admissions leads to a bias that tends to favor students who don't have a sense of self and have gone through life trying to figure out what other people want them to be.
Interesting. Sean, I saw you, well, I think I saw you nod in agreement with the professor's comment on the data lining up. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, I'd add just like a layer to that. Yes, I mean, if you look at our rankings, mid to large state schools tend to be more towards the top. Private schools fall, there's a few Chicago's in the top and a few others, but then they kind of, there's much less of a pattern there. And I do think I think a lot of what Mark said sounds plausible and right. And then I also think at these, especially at the larger state schools, what you may see happening is, well, there's some of these schools have 30, 40, 50,000 students enrolled. I would hope most students can find someone they feel comfortable expressing themselves to when there's like that big of a pool of people versus an environment like at a Harvard or at a small liberal arts school. I mean, liberal arts schools have even smaller student bodies, but like this is a much smaller student body and it has more of a feel of everybody knows everybody to a degree. So I think those are factors too, for sure.
Gotcha. Thank you. Omar or Gia, did you want to weigh in on that as two people who've gone through admissions processes at Harvard?
I think as for me, perhaps there are exceptions to the norm, perhaps the professor may have stated, but I think that perhaps in general, I think that is I think that's a plausible point, but I also think that in general, Harvard students, at least people that I've met, there's something that they're exceptionally good at in general, right? There's like one or two big spikes, and whether it's a personality or ability of some sort. And sometimes it's super academic, sometimes it's super social, sometimes it's very, very different. And it's interesting because sometimes I meet people who they are just unbelievable geniuses at one subject like physics or math, but they know very little about politics or economics or sort of any kind of the social discourse. And when I talk to them at least, generally speaking, there's like a sense of curiosity as well. And college, I think, is a pretty formative experience. I mean, a lot of us, I think, as freshmen, we come in, even though high school has sort of taught us a little bit, I think college is where we sort of discover more about ourselves, our identities, who we are. From my experience, it's been that case for me too. I mean, politically, I formed a lot of my beliefs while here, ironically, more towards the conservative side of things. And so I think that while it might be true that, yes, there is that sort of self-selection or molding your application to, tend to the eyes of whoever's looking at your application. Personally, I believe that actually, it's not the way to go. Some people do it, not saying it's not true, but I think that authenticity is something that can be found. It's actually found relatively commonly. Of course, there are some people who, sure, you can't really find much authenticity. I will admit, I will concede that point. But at least in groups that I've been in, the Salient and data analytics and orchestras as well, the opera, the ballet, these groups, they have some extraordinary people that I'm learning so much about them as well. So it's a mix. I think it's on a case by case basis, but I
Thank
certainly
you. Thank you. Gia, did you want to weigh in?
Let's see. So, I mean, I applied for college like 30 years ago. So, and I didn't know anything, to be completely honest. I applied from overseas and I put in my application, didn't have any advice from anybody. And so for that part, it's very hard for me to answer. But also 30 years ago, the environment was also very different. When I was back on campus, another Ivy campus, I felt like, yeah, I could see the leaning politically, but at the same time, at that time, people were pretty comfortable voicing their opinions. And that to me was kind of the utopia, that exactly why I came to the US for education. Back in business school, like that was also 15, 17 years ago. Still, it was, we held very robust classroom discussions without too much concern about, certain things, and we could play devil's advocate. What I'm saying is that after or in the most recent years, people become a little bit more guarded during discussions among alumni group, especially when it touches upon political issues and so forth. It's sad because you like it or not, politics is a big part of our life, and that's how our country is governed and how we organize, our society and so on and so forth. And it's a little sad that unless you are part of the majority group, seems like people are very guarded in terms of, voicing the opinions or try not to touch upon certain discussion. Now, it's interesting that I had a visit. Sorry, it's a little bit digress, but bear with me. I visited a micro school, and it's for elementary school students. And they deliberately taught students to say in a very civilized way, I disagree, or I agree, but in a very civilized way. And I just wish that in today's academic environment, we don't go to extremes. One extreme being that people just shout down the speakers and if they don't agree. And the other extreme is that people are not comfortable talking about their, voicing their opinions in an assertive way, but, civilized way. Certainly there are people in the middle that can handle it very well, but that seems to me to be the very, very minority. And I think that it would be best if we could rebuild this to allow everybody to have this sort of norm in mind that we can disagree, but disagree in a civilized way, even if we think that the speakers are dead wrong. So that would be the ideal.
Gotcha. Well, thank you. And I want to get to the audience Q&A because we have a lot of interesting questions coming in, but I also have a favorite question I love to ask in situations like this. And I think you just answered it for me, Gia, but I'll give you the opportunity to answer one more time if you want. So I'm going to go just down the line here. I'll start with you. If each of you could suggest one thing you think could start to fix the campus culture at Harvard, what would it be? And like I said, you might have just answered that for me. So if you want to pass, I'll accept, but figured I'd ask anyway.
One thing, I do think that we want more honest intellectual diversity. I think it probably does pretty well on the natural science side. On the social science side, I'm not on campus right now, so please correct me, Mark and Omar. I do think that it is important to, somehow to have some kind of maybe pre-enrollment discussion or free speech class to set up this norm that during our 4 years here, we're going to have a lot of disagreements, but that's okay. And it would be good that if we can, just allow the students to form this norm and truly take it to heart that it's okay to voice dissenting opinions, but let's do it in a kind and civilized way. And also make sure that there's no repercussion if we do so And I think that's, if we could do something like that, I think it's going to require reminding and so on and so forth, but in a very kind way. Hopefully that would help folks to get comfortable, because I read something, was it George Orwell said something like, even if the law says protects free speech, unless the majority of the citizens do practice it, the minority is going to feel so uncomfortable that they're just going to be sort of hiding in the background, and free speech is just in the name, but not actually in practice.
Gotcha. Thank you. Yeah, the freshman orientation or a pre-enrollment class, it's a big one. Fire developed a orientation program for that exact reason. Some of the better schools in the rankings, and I don't have it right in front of me, so Sean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Purdue's pretty high. They have a great freshman orientation that I always point to. But to continue this kind of rapid fire, one thing you I think could start to fix the campus culture. Omar, why don't you take it away?
Sure. I think the biggest element is insecurity. So I think this actually ties into Professor Ramseyr's argument as well about the way, students may mold themselves in the admissions process and maybe even after that. So I think that a lot of people come onto Harvard's campus definitely feeling very, very insecure because of the fact that, all the number ones from around the world converge into one spot. And now everyone's a great achiever in some respect, and now they're all in the same classroom. And I think that puts a lot of pressure on people to act a certain way. There definitely are facades that people definitely put up in any kind of interaction, and again, we all do this to some degree in different environments, but I think especially at a place like Harvard, with a lot of high achieving people, can be very intimidating for some people, for most people. And, we've probably heard about imposter syndrome and, the feeling of not belonging to an institution like Harvard based on whatever ability. I think that's a really big contributing factor to why people don't speak their minds. And they don't believe that their authentic selves is good enough. They have to strive for some ideal that either the administration puts down, or faculty, or other peers who are more vocal than they are. And so I think that drowns out a lot of the authenticity. So I think it's actually connected. I would say, in summary, reducing insecurity, and I think that would do a lot to increase authenticity and actually get people to just speak plainly, truly, and not either self-censor or just modify the way they talk based on who they're talking to. So
I like that a lot. Thank you. Professor, you're up.
I think I would just second what Omar said. Faculty too, but especially undergraduates, they need friends. I mean, I think that's another way of putting what you said. We have to figure out how students can each of the students can come up with a circle of 3 or 4 very close friends. Somebody that you can talk to, and then you won't feel as scared and you won't be as worried. And Charles Murray comes to speak, and your friends will say, well, let's just go out and have a hamburger instead. And one doesn't have to try to shout him down and so forth. I think the insecurity goes partly to just people feeling alone.
Thank you. Sean, last but not least, and then we'll get to some audience questions.
Yeah, I think some kind of, and I would say probably not even just orientation, but some kind of program that I think ideally, while participation in it would help reduce these insecurities. But I do, there's peer-reviewed research that suggests things like, if you've taken a civics class, you tend to be more supportive of free speech and more tolerant of dissenting views. And so that's what I say, like a component in an orientation that does this. But one question we're asking at FIRE is like, how effective is it? For how long? Did the effects decay? Does that effect of going through this civics or orientation on free speech or whatever it is does that stick? And like when we check a year later, are you still where you moved to, like right after the program? I think it's important to assess those, but I think those are very good options. And I mean, you mentioned the Purdue one, and I know like one outcome that's always stuck with me that I heard from our conference a few years ago. A faculty member was presenting some data on Purdue's orientation program. Before it was introduced, they would receive a number of complaints from students about a campus preacher that would come to campus and basically be yelling about how they're immoral and you need to be pro-life and all this stuff. After they introduced their orientation module, the complaints from students effectively dropped to zero about whenever this campus preacher showed up. There's still complaints from other people like staff or if parents were on campus and saw it and things like that. But from the students, it effectively dropped to zero. So that really stuck with me as whatever happened there, that seems to have had some kind of effect on students and then maybe a lasting one. So.
Gotcha. All right. Well, thank you. I'm going to turn to some of the audience questions. I see this one popping up in a few different ways. So I'm just going to use my powers as moderator to say I'm going to answer it myself, and then we'll move on to another one. This audience member asked, Connor stated in his intro that FIRE is for freedom of speech, irrespective of what opinions are expressed. What is FIRE's position with respect to the statements made by some 30 Harvard student organizations expressing support for Hamas and blaming Israel for the savage attacks last weekend? This is one FIRE's gotten a few times in the past couple of days. And it boils down to, regardless of one's opinion about the arguments that students, faculty, or campus groups are asserting, there's no doubt the First Amendment protects their rights to express those opinions. Universities must be a place where difficult issues are openly debated and discussed. And this is something that has been backed up in the courts repeatedly. The Supreme Court covered it better than I could, so I'm just going to quote them and get out of the way. In West Virginia v. Barnett, they wrote, quote, freedom to differ is not limited to things that do not matter much. That would be a mere shadow of freedom. The test of its substance is the right to differ as to things that touch the heart of the existing order. So that's the answer to that one right there. Another question that I think is real interesting, especially right now, and I'll kick it to our student, alum, and professor. How do you expect things will change either way with the new president at Harvard? Whoever wants to take it is free to take it, or I will call names.
I might provide a little bit of input into this. So I think someone also mentioned the Q&A that Claudine Gay was one of the people to support Professor Roland Fryer's revoking of tenure. I personally know Professor Fryer. I took a class with him last fall and got to know him gradually over the course of last year, and had the privilege of getting to know him more personally as well. I think the administration in general actually has a less of a relevant role in the direction of the university than one might think, at least from the student body's perspective, because I think that a lot of times the administration, including Dean Khurana of the college, they're looking for students to take the initiative to create some sort of change. They're going to, generally speaking, step away from that most of the time. Of course, there are a lot of instances where the administration, one way or another, will try to, shove something down the throats of students. That's happened a few times, especially with gender equity and, a lot of LGBTQ initiatives have sort of been endorsed by the administration. A lot of students kind of find that a little bit, disconcerting, depending on who you ask. I think that Claudine Gay, given her track record, might steer it in a worse direction. Hopefully not, because I think the student body's contribution to the direction is much more of a important contribution than the administration's is, at least from a student's perspective. I'm not sure from a faculty's perspective, though. I can't speak to that, or from an alum.
Professor or Gia, if you want to comment, feel free. If not, I have plenty of other interesting questions as well.
I thought Omar's comments were extremely interesting, but yeah,
Great.
I'll wait and see.
All right, then, Sean, I'm going to direct this next one at you, and it's kind of a two-parter, so I apologize. And I'm juggling Q&A now on two screens just to make sure I don't miss anything. So if you see me look away, I apologize. So Sean, could you describe more how Harvard ranked on the other portions of the survey besides cancellations and what those rankings say about the overall free speech environment? And then the second part of that, I don't know, I don't know if we have this data either at Harvard or nationwide. Is there a statistical difference between STEM students and humanities students regarding their free speech attitudes? I don't know if we survey for program demographics, if that's the proper term.
So, all right, so the first question, rankings.thefire.org has the full list of the rankings, and we list where they rank on all these different various components. So on comfort expressing ideas, Harvard came in 193rd. And even though we ranked 248 schools, I'll point out we surveyed 254, 6 of them get the warning rating from FIRE. So it's kind of an apples to orange comparison. So we set them aside and they're just warning. We calculate a score from them, but they don't get a rank. But for the purposes of ranking on the subcomponents, we include them. So this is 193rd out of 254 on comfort expressing ideas. On disruptive conduct, which is the questions that ask about shout downs, blocking entry, using violence against the speaker, Harvard ranks 198th. On administrative support, so this is how clear is it to you that the administration defends free speech and how likely is it they'll defend the speaker's rights during a controversy, Harvard ranks 183rd. On the tolerance components, this is where Harvard does the best. We break these out. So there's tolerance for controversial liberal speakers. Harvard ranks 59th on that. There's tolerance for controversial conservative speakers. Harvard actually ranks 39th on that. Their tolerance for controversial liberal speakers is still higher. They just don't rank as highly on that component, compared to the other schools. But like for Harvard, they are still more tolerant of the controversial liberal speakers. They are 27th on average tolerance. So when we put the two together and, calculate an average, and then a little bit worse, but we look at the difference, how much more do they tolerate one side or the other. Harvard's 97th on that. So like, that's more towards the middle of the pack, but still like not that bad considering there's 250 so schools ranked on these things. So that's where they rank on those. And then the last one on openness, they rank 68th. And so I think the tolerance and the openness rankings and components and scores, I think do speak to what Omar was describing, that the students seem like there are students there that definitely feel comfortable like talking to each other. It seems like to a degree there's tolerance of conservative viewpoints, especially compared to a lot of other schools. So I think those are the components Harvard does well on, and on the rest, as you heard, they don't do very well at all. On the STEM humanities question, we do have major. We've looked at, I haven't looked at it for this year's data yet, but I have looked at it in previous years' rankings, and STEM majors the free speech attitudes tend to be stronger there compared to humanities and social sciences.
Just let me add, you asked about students. If you looked at the faculty, it's not even close. Sort of the intolerance in modern universities is overwhelmingly out of the humanities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'd love to have faculty data as a component of the rankings. It's a bit trickier, as I'm sure to survey faculty, get them to participate. And, we've done national surveys of faculty, like we have, but a national survey, we need we're not just going to grab like 5 professors from Harvard and say, this is what your viewpoint diversity is. We need a couple hundred professors from Harvard to complete a survey for us to kind of measure that in any way, or to put them into the rankings. Like if we would give them basically the same survey. I think we'd tweak some of the questions to make it relevant for them. But I would love to do that. It's definitely a more difficult thing to do though than reaching the students.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So this is another interesting one, and I don't know if we can provide a concrete answer. But Gia, Omar, Professor Ramsayer, to what extent are the members of the Harvard Corporation aware of the dire state of academic freedom at Harvard? And what about the board? In my experience, I've worked higher ed adjacent for 8-9 years now. The trustees that ask those hard questions tend to be few and far between, but every once in a while, there's an all-star on the board that kind of drags the whole board up. And I'm not as familiar with the situation at Harvard, but maybe one of you can answer that question. And I'll take the silence as a I don't know, which is also perfectly fine.
Also, actually, just a quick comment about that. I think Penny Pritzker just took a position, I think, on the board. I'm not sure which position, but a friend of mine who's part of the Salient met with a few of the board members in the past, and I think the general consensus was that, at least among my friend and a few other friends of mine, was that Pritzker was probably not going to be a good addition to the cause of increasing academic freedom. Again, I can't speak personally to it because I don't personally know anyone on the board, but I think for the most part, it's probably, my bet would be apathy. Probably just don't really care too much about it, but I can't speak to it personally.
Gotcha. Thank you. Gia, you just unmuted. Did you have something?
Sure. I just wanted to actually ask a question in terms of what FIRE has learned from other institutions' experience, how to make the board more aware, or perhaps, if there's a way for alumni to elect board members or faculty to voice their opinions to get, board responses to make this a more front and center issue. And I don't know if there are other institutions that have done this and have shown, significant results in improvement. And, I think it's definitely something that Harvard can learn from. Yeah.
So Fire's learned a couple things, and I'll try to keep it brief so we can sneak in another question or two. To get on the board at Harvard, Harvey Silverglate, Fire's co-founder, tried a petition run last year. To even get on the ballot, you need something well over, I think it's 3,500 petition signatures from Harvard graduates. And then, just to get on the ballot, then there's the more complex voting system. So there are access to the board, getting on the board, running for the board position, even as an alum who isn't just nominated by the school, is challenging in and of itself. And then, a lot of times in my experience, boards are positions for donors. They're very well established people, but they're not people who know how to run a college or university. So a lot of times they're not stepping in unless it gets really bad. Look at a situation like Hamline University in Minnesota. They didn't renew an adjunct professor who showed a portrait of the Prophet Muhammad in an art class. It's been covered everywhere. The board didn't respond, issue a statement, didn't do any investigation, to my knowledge, until the university was dragged in the press for weeks. So sometimes it takes an effort. At other schools, there are folks like Karen Taylor Robson in the Arizona State system who are real engaged on this, and like I mentioned, they'll drag the entire board up. But my recommendation for alumni, make noise, but do it in a way that shows your university first, right? You're not there to tear it down. You're there to build the university up to what it once was, to what you want it to be, to continue serving, future generations of students. And, as long as you keep that drumbeat going, it's tough to ignore. So that would be my immediate recommendation. And I'm going to try to sneak in one last question or two. And for all the attendees, I have all your questions. We'll save them, and we'll do our best to answer all of you by email after the fact. And this recording will be made available. Professor Ramsayer, I'm quoting this. You've painted a very grim picture of what it is like to be a professor at Harvard. Do you think fear of repercussions impacts the way faculty teach, their relationships they build with students, and what they dare say in class?
Oh, of course. Absolutely. Yeah. No, I mean, without a question. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. I figured that was going to be a quick one. It's why I wanted to sneak it in. Let me look for another one. Gia, thank you for sharing your perspective from living in another country with different free speech standards. What would be your top calls to action to reverse the move of higher education toward more of a resemblance of free speech suppression and education from your experience in China? Is that enough to answer that? Okay.
Yes, it's well, certainly. Thank you for that question. It takes everybody to work together. As Dr. or Professor Ramsayer said, that admissions is part of the story, and faculty recruiting, it's also, and the tenure process, it's also part of the story. And how to, make alumni aware of the situation and get the majority's buy-in to influence the board and to have a very constructive dialogue with the administration. That's also another leg. So it does take a lot to get free speech, sort of up close to our ideal. I would say we'll never get to be perfect, but I do think that events like this hopefully helps. And I'm definitely asking all participants to talk to people around you, alumni, have discussions about this. And and kudos to, Professor Ramsayer and Omar for doing this from campus, in terms of having that dialogue, constant dialogue with your student groups, and also reach out to students who may not be in your immediate circle. And I think, you're very, very, sounds like you're very fortunate. I'm actually very glad that I think that it's true that among, certain students, there is a group of students that are still, having that curiosity to do so. It's really good to see. And our job is to expand that circle, make it sort of like, this is not just a few people, but hopefully more and more Harvard students will be doing that. So that would be my hope.
Thank you so much. And thank you all, Gia, Sean, Mark, Omar, for attending. I had a great time. Based on the number of questions we got from the audience, I think they also had a good time. And like I said, the recording will be made available, and we'll do our damnedest to get to every one of your questions via email after the fact. So thank you for sticking with us for just over an hour now, and enjoy the rest of your evenings. Take care.
Thank you.